I'm not. So, hey, Leslie,
Yeah.
am I a co-host? Because I've got to, I don't see.
Yeah, I made you a co-host, but
Okay, good. Cool.
let me double check. Yeah, you're a co-host.
Because I don't see my name or face on the screen. Oh, hold on. Here's continue.
If you go to are you in the participants panel?
Let's see. Oh yeah, there it is. Yep, yep. Good, good. All good. Yep.
Should I hit continue for?
Yeah, it doesn't matter, but yeah, go ahead. You'll
For being recorded.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Mark, I always feel like it's good to have somebody else as a co-host, because I guess what happens, because one time I got kicked out and it was a webinar and I was like, oh my goodness, the whole webinar is shut down, but it reassigned the host to somebody else.
Oh,
But I still always, I feel better having somebody else as a co-host or something, just in
right.
case.
Yeah.
Well, it's 10. Should we wait another minute or so, or should
Another
we?
minute. Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Wait a minute.
All right, Mark, I have 10:01.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Before we get started, I'm going to go over the usual format that we'll be using today for anyone who's joining us for the first time. As you probably are aware, this lecture is taking place over Zoom webinar. During a webinar, you will only see the lecturer and the person introducing him or her on the screen. You will not see yourself or other attendees. Attendees' microphones will be kept muted and questions will be taken at the end of the lecture for the speaker and managed through the chat function. You can find the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the middle. Please make sure before you submit your question to select the option right above the chat box to send your question to both panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your question. The default is to send it to just panelists, so the three of us here on the screen would be the only ones to see your question. Once you select the option to send your question to both panelists and attendees, hit enter to submit it. All right, Mark?
Good morning. I am pleased to introduce Kevin Bushweller, who's going to be talking to us about how COVID-19 is transforming K-12 education. Kevin is an assistant managing editor for Education Week, the leading news magazine about education, and he oversees coverage of education technology, learning environments, and also the weekly Ed Week Tech Leader, which is a news service for ed tech leaders in K-12 education. He's also the executive project editor of Technology Counts, which is Ed Week's annual report about the state of educational technology in the US. Kevin, please take it away.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. Yeah, so how COVID-19 is transforming K-12 education. So that's the big picture theme for today's presentation and discussion. I'm going to run through a bunch of stories within that big picture story to give you a detailed understanding of how things are changing in the K-12 world and why. But first, a big thank you for being here, and a big thank you for being the kind of curious, lifelong learners that we should all aspire to be. I think it's exciting to see what's going on in education right now, and the fact that you're curious about it really is great. So a little bit about, first, before I get started, a little bit about Education Week. Education Week is run by a company called Editorial Projects in Education. It's a nonprofit 501c3. It's independent and nonpartisan, and it's based near where a lot of you probably live in the DC area in Bethesda, Maryland. And we cover K-12 education for audiences of school district leaders, principals, and teachers. It's also one of the first nonprofit news services in the country. That's a trend right now. You're seeing more and more of these nonprofit news services popping up. Our company has made a big shift from print to digital over the past decade, and edweek.org, our website, generates 3.3 million page views per month to our articles, special reports, video content, and other offerings. We also produce a business intelligence service called EdWeek Market Brief that serves senior executives in the education industry. And most of our employees live in the Washington area, but some, like me, live in other parts of the country. As it is right now, though, everyone is working remotely. So a little bit about myself too. I actually lived in the DC area for about 30 years. I lived in the city. I lived in Charles County, Maryland, in Alexandria, and Prince William County in Virginia. And then 4 years ago, I moved back to my home state of Vermont. My wife and I are at the tail end of raising 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and the girl is the youngest. And I am a lifelong ice hockey player and the oldest player on my adult league team. And at age 57, I am still trying to learn how to perfect my game. So lifelong learning, it's important. But enough about me. Let's take a look at the most disruptive year in the modern history of K-12 education. So massive learning loss. From nearly the very first week that US schools entered a quote new normal due to COVID-19, educators and researchers have basically sounded the alarm about its detrimental effects on learning. Almost everything researchers know about what affects learning, time on task, online learning, summer learning loss, and chronic absenteeism, indicates that many students are likely falling much farther behind. Just how much students could regress remains a matter of some debate in education circles, but one estimate put it at a half or more a year of learning. One big problem that's fueling this, that's fueling learning loss, is absences. So I think I was talking to someone, and they said that 90% of success in life is just showing up. And well, that's turning out to be a growing problem for many students. Daily absences are on the rise across the board, regardless of the learning model schools are using. So let's look at that. Before the pandemic, absentee rates were 6%. This fall, they were 10%. And the highest absentee rates were in full-time remote learning at 12%, 10% for hybrid instruction, which is a mix of remote and in-person instruction, and 8% for full-time in-person learning. So even full-time in-person learning was higher than the average before the pandemic. That's a big challenge for schools right now. So teacher morale and student morale have taken big hits during this time. So if you look at this slide, we at EdWeek, we have part of the company, there's a division of the company called the EdWeek Research Center, which conducts regular surveys of teachers, principals, and school district leaders. And during the pandemic, we've been doing monthly surveys to get a read on how teachers are feeling, the kind of problems they're dealing with, and how they're trying to solve those problems. So compared with morale prior to COVID-19, morale levels are, quote, either much lower or somewhat lower. 80% of district leaders and teachers said that was the case for students. 85% of district leaders and teachers said that was the case for teachers. Lower teacher morale is a big concern because students often pick up on how their teachers are feeling. And some research suggests a teacher's state of mind can actually have a very negative effect on student motivation. So school and district leaders really have an imperative to confront these challenges of morale, motivation, and engagement urgently, but also they need to do so smartly and thoughtfully. Concerns that significant numbers of students are disengaging from school completely or losing major academic ground can't be addressed without first tending to teachers' feelings about their effectiveness. So daily life in the classroom. So this tweet, if you take a look at the screen and you can read it, this tweet from a special education teacher named Wade Buckman, it blazed across social media, really striking a chord with his teaching peers, who then shared their own feelings of distress and flagging spirits. Yet what's interesting is still, despite the lower morale that teachers like Wade are facing, these sort of early predictions during at the very beginning of the pandemic that big numbers of teachers would leave the profession during COVID-19, those predictions did not materialize. Teachers generally stayed put in their jobs and tried to make the best of a difficult situation, and they're continuing to do so. Now, I want all of that sort of information I wanted to give you to give you the context or the atmosphere that educators are working in right now. And yet it's not all bad news. And this is also right here is where we start to see those sort of transformational things going on in education. So innovation and experimentation are literally off the charts. Seeing more of that than ever before. Teacher tech skills are leapfrogging to the next level. We did a whole report about this that was published at the end of last school year. Mark actually mentioned that. That's that Technology Counts report. If you want to get access to it, let me know after the presentation. Awareness of the importance of doing a better job meeting students' individual needs is growing. And it's interesting because I think teachers definitely get to know their students well, but during this time, what they've had more of with remote learning and hybrid learning is they're getting a closer peek into students' home lives and the personal struggles they're facing during remote learning. And I think that's given them an even more of a perspective about the importance of meeting the individual needs of students. And related to that is this rising emphasis on social emotional learning. So trying to come up with lessons and programs and initiatives that help students work on their social and emotional learning, as well as educators too. So let's take a look at some of these trends. So the teaching models schools are using this year. This is, definitely one of the more experimental approaches we're seeing during the pandemic. So 65% are using a hybrid model, and that is a mix of remote and in-person instruction. 19% are using full-time remote instruction, and 16% are using full-time in-person instruction. That full-time in-person instruction is different though than what full-time in-person instruction looked like prior to the pandemic. It's socially distanced instruction where kids are not working in groups as much. They're grouped in ways to protect their health. They're grouped in ways to protect the educator's health. It's a very different look. So, like I said, the hybrid model is the most common model, and I think that's one thing we're keeping an eye on, because that is an experimental trend that we are likely to see continue even after the pandemic. Already, districts are putting in place those kinds of models that would exist even after the pandemic ends. So some of the more popular approaches within the hybrid model, the first one, the binary choice, that's where students pick full-time virtual, or full-time in-person. So either they're going full-time virtual or they're going full-time to school, and that basically splits the numbers in a school so that they can have socially distanced in-person instruction. The other model is rotating in-person learning. So that's 2 days in person and then 2 to 3 days remote. That's what my daughter, who is a senior at a high school here in Vermont, that's what she's going through. And that's probably one of the more common models within the model. And then the other one is prioritizing in-person learning. So this is prioritizing in-person learning for students with the highest needs, the most vulnerable students, students who are in special education, English language learners, and others. So we've started to look at, where are these trends headed? And even though we've heard from a lot of teachers, and many teachers, they hate remote learning, understandably, for a lot of reasons. And millions of parents, including some of the people I work with, find it exhausting. They're trying to do their job like we are, and also keep their, help their kids with their lessons. And it is an incredible balancing act. The other thing is, even prior to the pandemic, a growing body of evidence suggests that, online learning isn't as effective as in-person learning, and especially in virtual charter schools. But, regardless, it is becoming clear to us that live streamed remote instruction is set to remain a significant part of K-12 education long after the coronavirus pandemic is finally under control. Pedro Martinez, the superintendent of the San Antonio School District, which educates 49,000 students, he said simply, quote, "There's no going back now." And since March, districts have distributed tens of millions of digital devices while making massive investments in at-home connectivity as well. And that almost overnight has created the infrastructure necessary to support widespread experimentation. In San Antonio, they're not the only one, of course. 10% of district leaders surveyed by the RAND Corporation this past fall said they had adopted or were considering a similar hybrid instructional model as what San Antonio is doing. And right now, what San Antonio is doing is 70% of their students are learning full-time in a full-time remote environment, and 30% are learning in a full-time in-person environment. And what the superintendent said is, when the pandemic ends and they continue to do some kind of hybrid model, he would like to see that ratio shift to 30% doing full-time remote instruction and 70% doing full-time in-person instruction. So to make that vision more feasible, though, some education leaders are already pushing for state-level policy changes since the coronavirus hit. For example, the Texas Education Agency has allowed schools to include remote instruction when calculating student attendance. And the San Antonio superintendent is actually advocating for state officials to make that a permanent change. So this is a lot of this growth in technology is creating, sort of a new one-to-one computing landscape. One-to-one computing had been, growing in schools at a sort of modest rate before the pandemic. Now it's becoming much bigger. And, we've been tracking purchases of digital devices over this time. And this market consulting group called Future Source Consulting found that US schools demand for digital devices is expected to stay robust through 2021, so through this year. The firm is projecting 16.7 million shipments of mobile devices to the US market in 2021. The pre-pandemic average was about 14 million. Now, many people argue that one-to-one computing environments basically better mirror modern work environments, like what we're in here, right? We have here, and give students greater access to information and interactive digital content. And others argue that giving digital devices to students also really helps bridge digital equity gaps between wealthier students who have easy access to digital devices at home and students from disadvantaged backgrounds who often have no devices at home or have to share just one with multiple family members. So these are just 3 examples of what has been happening over the past several months in this commitment to the expansion of technology. And it's worth reading these because these are huge bond measures. So a $1.3 billion initiative from the San Antonio district, the largest school bond in the city's history, and it includes $90 million to help pay for high-speed internet access, student computers, interactive smart boards, and new audio systems for classrooms. The next one, the largest school bond initiative actually in Texas history, from the Dallas Independent School District, where voters approved $3.2 billion for school construction and $270 million in technology upgrades. And the third one, a mammoth $7 billion bond issue by the Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in the country. And that includes a $405 million to furnish and equip schools with 21st century learning technologies and upgrade, install technology infrastructure, information systems, hardware, and software. It's really interesting, having covered education for almost 20 years now at Education Week, to look at these results. So, the question, this was one of our Ed Week Research Center surveys. When schools reopen, students increase levels of access to one-to-one computing, 1 device per student, will make high quality teaching and learning. And then they answered the question. So at least 1 out of 5 said a lot easier, and more than 7 out of 10 said a lot easier or a little easier. So 7 out of 10 think it's going to make it easier to build higher quality teaching and learning. clearly most educators see one-to-one computing as a positive development, but that was not the case 7 or 8 years ago when the trend was sort of emerging. At the time, there were some very costly failures. One big one was in Los Angeles, where in which the school district invested huge amounts of money to try to put digital devices in the hands of students. And the biggest problem was that the district did that with no big picture strategy for how to help teachers integrate the devices into teaching and learning in meaningful ways. They just plopped the devices, down in the classrooms. It was ridiculous, actually. Lots of legal and educational problems happened in the wake of that. And what that ultimately did is it left teachers with a very sour taste in their mouths for one-to-one computing. And that happened in some other districts too. The good news is I think that the education system learned some important lessons from those failures. So too much screen time. If any of you have teenage children, I'm sure this resonates with you. But it has, significant implications for learning too. American students have never had more access to digital devices for reading in and outside of school. But now there's emerging research and some troubling results from a test called the Nation's Report Card that raises questions about the effect of that all this digital access could have on students' long-term reading skills. So consider this. Only a little more than 1 in 3 American students read proficiently in grades 4 or 8, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Reading scores in both grades declined significantly across states, races, and income levels in public and private schools. And that was before the pandemic. The results have spurred a flurry of questions about what could drive such a broad-based drop. And it's worth reading this quote from Nat Malkus, the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, who noted that states' demographic and policy changes, they don't explain these widespread declines. So, quote, "My suspicion rides on the ubiquity of screens and our attempts to make those useful in educating kids, and the increase in their use outside of school. It could just be that actually technology is not the answer for education, but it's sort of the enemy, wearing down the attention span that it takes to develop a sense of reading for pleasure." Food for thought. But at the same time, there's all this growth and expansion in the use of technology and improving use of it too. And so this again is data from our survey data we collected during the pandemic. Since schools closed, and this is specifically a survey of teachers. Since schools closed, my ability to effectively use educational technology has improved a lot, has improved a little. So almost half of teachers said my ability to use technology has improved a lot. And 87% said it has improved. Several school district leaders we talked to said sizable percentages of their teachers, especially at the elementary level, did not use the district's learning management system prior to the pandemic. In the spring, that changed, and now virtually everyone has had some level of experience using their learning management systems. And learning management systems basically give schools the power to administer, document, track, report on, automate, and deliver educational courses, training programs or learning and development programs. They're very similar to the content management systems that we use at work. And then there have been other changes too that are most likely going to stick beyond the pandemic. The Los Angeles Unified School District, like I said, the second largest in the country, offered its teachers and other staff a stipend actually to get something called the Future Ready certification. And that's a micro-credential for developing lessons in a virtual or blended learning environment. And this is on top of the initial training that the district offered at the beginning of the coronavirus shutdowns to get teachers up to speed on the district's learning management system, video conferencing tools, and content resources. So clearly LA learned the lessons from the past and is putting in place a lot more training for teachers around technology. Now, all this development of technology skills is not going to suddenly disappear when students return to school buildings in most places. And many teachers we've talked to are already talking about how they're going to use these newly developed skills when the pandemic is over. And we've seen them use them with digital curricula and interactive content and new ways of communicating with students one-on-one. Personalizing learning. Personalized learning is a movement we have been covering at Education Week for nearly a decade now. It is basically a strategy for teaching and learning that focuses heavily on addressing students' individual academic strengths and weaknesses, as well as their personal interests and social emotional needs. This strategy also tends to emphasize mastery of content and individual pacing over time in a classroom. For years, there were a lot of criticisms of personalized learning that it relied too heavily on technology and algorithms and things like that, and not really thinking about the personal needs of students. That has shifted in recent years to more of a whole child approach and making the point that technology is just part of the ingredients to make personalized learning work well. But what has been interesting during the pandemic is we found that it's actually very difficult to pull off personalized learning in remote learning environments, full-time remote learning environments. More than half of educators from one of our surveys said teachers are not doing as well with personalizing instruction as they were before the pandemic. And most also say student group work and individual one-on-one time with teachers, which are hallmarks of personalized learning, are suffering, and they're even suffering in socially distanced classrooms. But, and this is like super interesting though, because I think sometimes when you see something that's difficult, you start to see why it's more important. What's interesting is that many educators though are telling us the experience of delivering remote and hybrid instruction during the pandemic has actually heightened their beliefs that schools need to do a better job, focusing on the individual needs of students. So we did a special report that looked at issues around student engagement. It was published about a month ago. So just to start, the reality is that many students, especially those in special education, are really struggling with virtual and hybrid learning models during this time. 83% of educators say kids are making less progress in English language arts than they were before the virus hit, according to our August survey. But, and this is a big but, for a small number of students, the pandemic cloud, if you want to call it that, has a thick silver lining. Those students are actually now learning better than ever. And many of these unexpected standouts fit a similar profile. They tend to have some level of anxiety about learning. They tend to be more introverted. They tend to have a history of some social challenges. Or, they might just be the kind of kid who learns better working independently. There are some high achieving kids who absolutely love this because they could just go at their own pace, and take on new projects while other students were progressing at a slower pace. So it's really important to remember that as we move forward, because as this Bob Cunningham, the executive director of learning development for this organization, understood, which works with vulnerable students. He said basically that everyone's talking about, oh, we can't wait till we get back to normal. And, well, I don't know, first of all, whether we'll ever get back to normal. We'll get back to some semblance of normal. But normal wasn't good. Normal, as in a traditional K-12 education, wasn't good for many kids. And we need to learn the lessons during this time so that we ensure that those kids, we continue to meet the individual needs of those kids. So this personal essay from one of my writers at Education Week, Allison Klein, is a great read that I think many of you would enjoy. This is a picture of Allison when she was in 7th grade. It really resonated for me because I moved around a lot as a kid from state to state, and I always had to go through being the new kid at the school. And I think it'll resonate for you for other reasons. So I just want to read a short snippet from Allison's essay, and I would encourage you to access it online sometime after this presentation. So, quote, "As a full-fledged grown-up education reporter and new mom, I was, of course, deeply concerned when schools across the country shut down last spring to avoid spreading the coronavirus. I knew it would exacerbate achievement gaps, strain families, and make educators' tough jobs even harder. But the socially awkward middle schooler that still lurks somewhere inside me is just a tiny bit jealous of today's COVID kids. If there had been a global pandemic back in the early 90s, when I was in 7th grade, I would have been secretly grateful to the virus that got me out of my scary place, the middle school cafeteria." So I think schools are listening more and more to that perspective. And I think they're learning some important lessons about understanding kids who have that perspective when they're struggling through elementary or middle or high school. So the mastery versus seat time debate heats up. This to me is a real fascinating policy issue. COVID-19 has forced educators and policymakers to re-examine some of their core practices and beliefs, and in some cases, circumvent them altogether. Measuring learning by how much time students spend in a classroom could be next for an overhaul. It won't be easy if they decide to overhaul it, but there's a lot of push in that direction. So numerous US school districts have experimented in recent years with a teaching approach that emphasizes student mastery of discrete skills or competencies over assessment-based sort of one-size-fits-all measures of learning progress. And most states have policies that permit this experimentation, and a handful have explicitly codified efforts to expand this type of education. Proponents of the model believe the pandemic has reinforced its value. When students don't have the luxury of being in the same room as their teachers all day, they need to draw from intrinsic motivation. and teachers can't expect all students to progress at the same pace. People are different, given, and also given the wide variation in access to and comfort with technology tools. Some schools that had already started making these changes have advanced their efforts more quickly since last March, and others have newly adopted competency-based or personalized learning practices, like allowing students in a class to progress through learning material at their own individual pace, simply out of necessity. Most states have relaxed policies that require students to complete a certain number of in-person school days in a given year for this school year, giving schools more flexibility to provide instruction for students using the methods that work best under the COVID-19 constraints. And most of these policy changes were really not designed to stick long-term, but competency-based learning advocates think they should, and they might. So, as you know, this is sort of an obvious point. It's an anxious time for students, but a quick summary of this survey. A survey of 3,300 teenagers in June found they are much more concerned than usual about their health and the health and financial stability of their families. 30% of teens reported in the survey, which was by America's Promise Alliance, that they are more worried than normal about basic needs, including food, medicine, and safety. And over a quarter said they are losing more sleep, feeling more unhappy or depressed, feeling under constant strain, or losing confidence in themselves. And that's why you're seeing an even much greater emphasis on an approach called social emotional learning, which was already growing before the pandemic, but is now becoming an even bigger priority. So in case you're not familiar with this concept, and educators, they love acronyms too, so I'll give you the acronym, but the acronym is SEL, so they call it SEL. But according to the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, SEL is the, quote, process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Now let's consider where we're at right now. Schools are working through this academic year during a pandemic, an economic recession, and national protests over police killings of Black Americans. The confluence of these seismic challenges makes developing students' social and emotional skills critical to their academic fortunes. If you're not feeling good about yourself, it's much harder to learn. And despite all these challenges vying for school administrators' attention during this time, it appears that interest in SEL remains high, as you can see in the survey results on the slide. Also, large percentages of state education departments told the Collaborative in a survey that SEL was either a top priority in their pandemic response plans or it increased in priority since the pandemic began. So big, at the same time as all these changes are happening, they're also exposing huge equity problems. And the good news, huge equity problems in students' access, not just to technology, but to quality curriculum, to quality teaching, to support all across the board. It really has shown that these problems have to be addressed. Now, the good news is you can't solve a problem until you recognize that it's a problem. The bad news is there will be limited resources to address a lot of these equity issues, and one of the biggest ones is home internet access. So that solving the equity problem is their schools are already putting measures in place to try to tackle this. So one of the more interesting interesting ones for students is it says plan targeted acceleration instead of remedial tracks that risk leaving some students permanently behind. So these efforts that schools are putting in place to create accelerated learning for all students are really interesting, and we're going to, we've been reporting on those and we'll continue to do so. And I think that's also another example of the kind of experimentation that's going on in schools right now that is probably going to last beyond the pandemic. So new president, new agenda. Joe Biden is our new president. That is a fact, and that fact means there will be a new education agenda at the federal level. So very quickly, on a number of these factors, and today even there was news about this. A story about a massive COVID-19 relief package, and also the president's plans for trying to reopen as many schools as possible. But here is the list of, a number of things you'll probably expect to see that a Biden administration will tackle. On civil rights, Biden will likely restore a federal directive that schools may be in violation of civil rights laws if they discipline students of color disproportionately, regardless of whether there is discriminatory intent. On the coronavirus, Biden, yesterday made it clear that educators need more emergency funding and clear federal guidelines on how to reopen schools. He created a 5-step roadmap before he was inaugurated, and yesterday there's more details about that. Although the COVID-19 relief package still would need to be approved by Congress. On desegregation, the Democratic Party platform pledges to use the federal government to promote voluntary school desegregation efforts around magnet schools and transportation initiatives. Education funding, Biden has pledged to triple or nearly triple federal funding for students from low-income households and fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act within 10 years. On remote learning, the new president's campaign roadmap cited the need to deliver high quality remote and hybrid learning with a special emphasis on students with disabilities, English language learners, and students who do not have access to specific technology such as broadband and devices. That's also an effort you might see continue after the pandemic. School choice, Biden actually opposes charter schools operated by for-profit companies and believes that charters siphon off money from regular public schools, but he does believe that some charter models do work. On school safety, as a US Senator, Biden worked on the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 and was a strong supporter of police in schools, which has been an issue over the past year. On student testing, the president has said he opposes mandatory standardized tests and that tests take too much autonomy away from what teachers do in their classrooms. That's an interesting perspective, and we'll see, how much that shapes what's going on in the classroom. And lastly, on teacher pay, he argues that a major reason to increase federal education funding is to raise teacher pay, and he has put a focus on boosting the salaries of teachers who work in schools with large shares of disadvantaged students. And now we have a new education secretary. Last month, President Biden announced Miguel Cardona, Connecticut's education commissioner, as his pick to be the nation's top education official. In selecting Cardona, who's 45 years old and a former teacher, principal, and district administrator, Biden fulfilled his campaign pledge to appoint a public school educator to the role. And his choice was actually met with enthusiasm from education groups across the ideological spectrum. So, over the next few months, we'll start to see, what that agenda looks like. And lastly, the big takeaway. So there's an old English proverb that says necessity is the mother of invention. It is so relevant now, and not just for schools, of course. But when it comes to schools, I heard another saying too recently, and it says that when it comes to the pace of change, crisis is the mother of implementation. So true. We are seeing that play out in schools now. Sure, schools are slow to change. That has been the case for generations. But the pace of change in everything these days is now faster than ever. So the big takeaway is that the pandemic is forcing school leaders to take a hard look at the K-12 system, and many are concluding that for K-12 schools to stay relevant and effective, they need to become much more nimble and much more able to pivot when necessary. The pandemic has sped up that shift significantly. And now, questions, comments, concerns, pushback. Please, I love questions.
Thanks, Kevin. If you want, you could stop sharing so we could we could see you in full screen. But okay, the first question is how will schools make up this school year with what students don't learn? Will some students, for example, have to repeat a grade, or will there be I don't know, full-time summer school?
That is a fantastic question, and we have done quite a bit of coverage around that. I think schools are really struggling with that issue now. Some in it, and it really depends on the district. Some are using what I mentioned in one of those slides, these accelerated learning programs to help kids catch back up because of they fell behind. Others are right now working on strategies to put in place summer school or summer learning programs that they will target at kids who have fallen behind. And others are, they're sort of being a little bit more flexible in their accountability. They're choosing not to hold students back and trying to figure out how to take a more, sort of individualized approach and help them catch up even as they're progressed to the next grade. That is going to be that is a huge issue right now for schools, many of which are trying to put together plans to address that. And I think you'll start to see those plans emerge in much more detail over the next few months.
Then we had a question about a couple questions about remote learning. I guess the question is, once the pandemic is over, why would we need remote learning? And one of our members is suspicious that it's just a way, a couple actually, suspicious that it's just a way for school districts to save money and maybe, by cutting down in maintenance and the size of physical facilities.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. And I think it's a criticism we've heard from other folks too. I think that it's kind of like what I was talking about. The ones who are trying to do it in a way that's thoughtful and helpful they're trying to think about, once the pandemic is over, how they can use it to fill gaps. So let me give you an example. There's a county in, I think it was Georgia, we reported on, and the one school wanted to offer, I think it was a Chinese language program to students, and there were some students in the school who wanted to take Chinese, but they didn't have enough students to take that course. So they couldn't justify hiring a teacher because that's actually, hiring one teacher is actually fairly costly just to meet the needs of a handful of students. So what the district did is there were other high schools in that area that also had handfuls of students who wanted to learn, I think it was Chinese, I think it was a language. So the district basically, put together an online course so that all the students from those various high schools could remote in to that course and participate in it, and they didn't have to hire a Chinese a teacher to teach Chinese, at every one of those 3 high schools or 2 high schools. So the other thing, and I sort of I tried to make this clear, and this has come up in some of our reporting, is that some students have found this type of learning really, resonates with them and works with them, and it's been a better experience for them, during the pandemic. And I think that, another argument some folks make is that when you look at how we work is not, and this was prior to the pandemic, it's not like for most people, it's not full-time remote learning, although that trend is growing in the workplace. It's more of a hybrid approach. A couple days you work from home, you go to school, or you go to work for a few days. And I think that that's what we saw happening in schools, and that was the most popular model during the pandemic. So it's more about how to use remote learning and hybrid learning to fill gaps, and districts may make some decisions that there may be times when they're strapped for money where they do make it for cost reasons, and that's I can understand, you can understand why they might have to do that, because school districts are going to be facing some of the most difficult budget decisions they've had to make in recent years, because the economy has been, pummeled by the coronavirus, and school district budgets may get hit pretty hard, especially starting, with this next year.
Are there ongoing research studies of best practices in remote learning? So going forward, we can choose what works.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would encourage you to read edweek.org. We did a whole series this summer and into the fall. It was titled "How We Go Back to School," and it tackled remote learning, hybrid learning, SEL, learning loss, a whole bunch of equity issues and things like that. But the remote and hybrid ones, the remote parts of those special reports did give specific tips on what you should be doing. And we are tracking the research too. We've done some coverage. We've did a story recently about best practices for hybrid learning specifically. I actually moderated a webinar about that, which is available on demand. So they are, it's sort of something that's kind of still in motion too. I think a lot of schools are still trying to, learn important lessons now. Last spring was very much a crisis mode. Just, everyone just sort of leaped into remote learning full time and just tried to make it through the day. I think this school year has been a little bit more strategic and deliberate and thoughtful than last spring. And there's going to be some really interesting lessons learned that come out of that.
One of our members raises an important issue of after-school care or child care generally. I mean, schools, even apart from after-school care, provide a place to park kids, not to park, for kids to have a safe environment while both parents are off working, or if it's a single parent home where the only parent is off working. So how does remote learning jibe with the need for so many families for the child to be physically in the school?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge, and that's a big equity challenge. So there are a lot of students this year whose parents do not have jobs where they can work from home, who had to go to, they had to go to a physical place to do their jobs, which meant that the students were left to their own devices at home. Not literally, they're left to to themselves to try and figure things out. They didn't get the support they needed from their parents because their parents couldn't give it to them during the day. They were working. There are also a number of students whose parents simply, they just don't have the kind of technology skills that allow them to help those kids. I think it's really important for schools to do the best they can to identify which kids need help and to provide whatever supports they have if they are doing remote learning. Now, this is an important point too, and I made it early in the presentation, is that many school districts are prioritizing in-person learning for the most vulnerable students. And the most vulnerable students could it possibly include students who have no parents at home during the day. That would be a district decision. But those, prioritizing them for in-person learning means they're not going to, they're going to get the help they need and not just be lost on a laptop trying to figure out how to make it through the day.
Do you think that the year-round school movement, the idea that schools should not be just a 9-month enterprise, will gain momentum as one way to address the losses due to the pandemic?
That's a really interesting question. Year-round schooling has been an issue that the K-12 world has been, debating for quite a long time now. And there are some school districts around the country that have those year-round schedules. And there is some research coming out about their effectiveness. I think that, maybe by default, in a way, you'll see some semblance of year-round schooling, and it gets to catching up on learning loss. So how are the summers used to help students catch up on learning loss? And if school districts see that those approaches work really effectively and students are learning in a much, more effective pace than in a typical schedule, you might see more districts embrace that approach.
Great. And final question, how are other developed countries managing K through 12 education during the pandemic? Are they also using remote learning as their primary approach?
Well, that's a great question. And we did do a story several months ago, one of my writers, about what different countries were doing, their approaches. If you want to follow up with me individually, my contact info is on the screen right now. I could track down that story for you because in this moment I can't remember the exact countries that were in that story, but it was a very good story, and it was kind of a mix. Some countries took were very deliberate in wanting to stick to in-person instruction, but socially distanced in-person instruction. So they made a commitment to that, and they tried to stick to that. And I think in some places, it might have been Denmark, I can't remember, that worked quite well. And the virus, although it might have been spreading in the community, it was not being spread by schools. Others have taken similar approaches to what you see in the United States, full-time remote learning, hybrid learning. A lot of the districts or a lot of countries have taken the same technological approach that you've seen in the United States, where schools are buying a lot more digital devices. They're trying to build up their tech infrastructure, so if necessary, students can learn at home. Great. And I think, one important point too, and I think all these countries and the United States and everything that we've been through, is one important lesson from all this too, is that if schools ever had to go through something like this again, whatever that was, that they're now much better prepared to deal with it. When it started in March, with a few exceptions, schools were not prepared at all for this pivot. And I think some really important lessons were learned that will be valuable. Hopefully they won't have to, but you just don't know.
Well, Kevin, I want to thank you very much for providing some really interesting, useful information and for showing us that, in fact, there are a number of rays of hope and that educators have, in fact, been able to having been handed a bunch of lemons, have been able to make lemonade. And that's really good to hear. Thanks again. And have fun cross-country skiing today.
No, thank you. And here, like I said, here's my my contact info is on the screen here. And feel free to email me if I mentioned an article or you saw a data point or something like that and you'd like me to follow up and track it down for you. We also have a library at EdWeek and they can help me track things down. So it's not a burden at all. I can do it for you.
Thanks a lot. And Leslie, let's just leave that up for another couple minutes so people can copy it down if they want. Thanks again, and have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.